Jill and I, as the moderators for today, would like to make this session as interactive as possible. So to raise your questions, either to a specific speaker or the general panel, please feel free to, at any time, always use the chat. I see that people have already been using it a bit, and that's very good. Keep up the good work. Jill and I will manage and select the questions to pose, and we will give you the opportunity to verbally elaborate on the question during the Q&A. So overall, we really hope to have a fruitful and, above else, a respectful discussion. So to also introduce myself, I am Naomi Appelman, and together with Jill Toe, we will be moderating today's session. We are together with Hans Zwart, who isn't here today, the co-founders of the Racism and Technology Center that is responsible for the organization of today's session. So as to the structure, I will firstly be giving a brief introduction of the topic of this panel and the Racism and Technology Center as the organizer of it. Then we will have a presentation by our three amazing speakers on the Dutch child benefit scandal as a case study for how to make the debate on digital rights less technocentric. After these presentations, Jill will pose some further questions to the speakers with the aim to draw out the broader lessons from this specific case study for the digital rights field, and after which we hope to open it up for questions, and hopefully there will be a lot of that and we can have a fruitful discussion. So I think that most people are here by now, and I think I'll just head into the substance. So as we wrote in the panel description, with this session, we want to contribute to making the debate on digital rights, and then specifically in relation to marginalized voices, less technocentric. So as is also indicated by the broader theme of this year's Privacy Camp, it's necessary to reevaluate how the digital rights field sees technology as a driving role in exacerbating and perpetuating social injustices. Within this broader idea, we have selected as a guiding question how we can identify the real harms automated systems can generate without disregarding the historical and social context that produced these systems in the first place and that these systems operate in. So in this panel, we concretely want to use the Dutch child benefit scandal as a specific and local case study, which can function as a starting point to have this broader discussion. So this specific and local case study opens up to a broader discussion on racist practices by governments, the increasing use of new technologies such as automated decision-making systems in government agencies, and importantly, the potentially outsized role that algorithms play in these discussions about these systems. So we, as the Racism and Technology Center, found it important to organize this panel as it connects very closely to the center's core mission. Jill Toe, Hans Zwart, and myself founded the Racism and Technology Center to help bridge the gap between anti-racist organizations and organizations that focus on digital rights. So we saw that where the former can often feel they lack the expertise or even the agency to address racism in a technological context, the latter, the digital rights organizations, are more often than not have a blind spot for these type of questions on inequality or racial inequality, as is also very much the theme of this year's Privacy Camp. So what we overall hope to achieve with this panel is to identify concrete harms, as well as to provide nuance to the discussion by decentering the role of technologies vis-à-vis social injustices. So originally, the ambition for this panel was to also center local knowledge and expertise by inviting anti-racist organizations from the Netherlands. However, due to capacity issues, both on our side, from the Racism and Technology Center, and for the anti-racism organizations we approached, and of course the short time span that Privacy Camp has, we unfortunately weren't able to do so. We feel this is also indicative of the broader issues and problems you run into trying to prioritize affected people in the discussions in primarily expert-dominated spaces, such as this one is as well. So this shows how within the digital rights field, and of course much broader, there's also a need to rethink more fundamentally who participates in discussions and how we can create space for the right people. I'm sure that our discussions today, and no doubt the inspiring talks by our speakers, will give us a lot to work with on how to make the debate on digital rights less technocentric and more focused on the people affected. So having said this, I want to turn now to our three wonderful speakers of today, Nadia, Merel, and Sanne. And as they are most capable of introducing themselves, I would like to ask them to do so before we move on to the presentation. Nadia, can I start with you and ask you to introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. Thanks so much for having me. I am Nadia Benaisa. I'm a lawyer. I work at Digital Freedom, which is a digital rights organization based in the Netherlands. I'm mainly focused on AI and GDPR issues.
Thank you so much, and amazing to have you here today. Sanne, can I ask you?
Hi, I'm Sanne. I work for the Justice, Equity and Technology Table, a network that tries to address the impact of data-driven policing all over Europe. And I'm super happy to join you today from a quite grey Amsterdam.
I'd say a very grey Amsterdam. Very happy to have you here. And last but certainly not least, Merel.
Hi, everybody. I'm Merel Koning. I'm a senior policy advisor at Amnesty International, and I lead the Dutch technology program there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So now we can move on to the brief 5 to 7 minute presentations by our three speakers, inspired by specific questions we discussed beforehand, allowing us to really zoom into the different aspects of this case study and to draw out these broader questions later. So to start with Merel, what we discussed that your talk would be inspired by is the question how the Dutch child benefit scandal has been framed and discussed. So can I please give you the floor?
Yes, and thank you. How the Dutch childcare benefit scandal was framed and discussed, I think the question should be slightly different. How is it still framed and discussed? Because it's an ongoing problem that the childcare benefit scandal is seen as an administrative failure. So for those who are not familiar with the case, I will give a brief introduction to it. From 2013 onwards, the Dutch tax authorities increasingly used algorithmic systems to detect fraud or potential fraud with people who applied for childcare benefits. Childcare benefits is a system in the Netherlands where you can apply and you can bring your child to daycare. It's great, and then you get part of the cost reimbursed from the government. In this whole system, there was a strong idea with the tax authorities that there was a lot of fraud. So they used automated systems to detect this type of fraud. In the initial algorithm, one of the parameters that was used was whether or not you had Dutch nationality. And that criteria mattered whether or not your risk score was increased. And that's racist. That is discriminatory. And that has been under the radar for many years in the Netherlands. What has also been under the radar is that this automated system that was used a self-learning algorithm. And over the course of time, this algorithm taught itself to focus primarily on people from low-income groups. So people who were in higher income groups, they were less seen as potential fraudsters, and people with low income were seen as potential fraudsters. So they also got a higher risk score in the end. So what happened was that people from low income families with migration backgrounds were the first people that were selected as potential fraudsters. And what happened once you were selected as a potential fraudster is very devastating and a black page in the history of the Dutch government, because fault after fault after fault was made. Not only the algorithm was problematic, but also the handling of the Dutch tax authorities afterwards. And quite problematic, not only the Dutch tax authorities, but also the courts that were supposed to protect these people. People were labeled as fraudsters where they were not. They had to repay all the childcare benefits at once. People lost their houses, they lost their jobs. In the end, 70,000 children became the victim of this scandal, and more than tens of thousands of families are impacted. And until this day, there is still no substantive solution for this. How it was framed in the media was as an administrative failure. How, of course, as Amnesty International, we think this should be framed is a human rights problem. And not only a human rights problem stemming from the use of automated decision-making systems, but a human rights problem stemming from institutional racism and sustained inequality and prolonged inequality and translated inequality into automated systems. The system was both discriminatory on the basis of race and ethnicity and on social and economic class. And with regard to the last type of discrimination, this is still, nobody's talking about this in the Netherlands. The whole childcare benefit scandal is not framed as a social economic problem or a social economic discrimination and the problem of discrimination as such, but it is still seen as administrative failure. We also see that in the way that the Dutch government is picking this up and trying to repair this. Many guidance papers and quite frankly, open and voluntary standards are now being discussed and developed within the government, whereas strict mandatory legislation for people working in the government to make sure that human rights are protected and to make sure that their practices are becoming less racist over time, or of course at least immediately would be best. This is still lacking, and this is very problematic in the framing. I think I'll just stop here and then continue via questions later on.
Thank you so much for giving this overview of what the scandal actually is and this great commentary to start with. And also thank you very much for staying perfectly within the time. Then we will be moving on to our second speaker, Sanne. And the guiding question that your presentation was inspired on is, what are the shortcomings and missing perspectives in these discussions?
Yeah, thanks, Merel, also for this great introduction. I just want to start by saying that background is not only in this topic, but when I was 11, my father, the breadwinner of the family, was fired. He appealed this and it was judged unruly, and he got some damage payments, but he was also considered too old on the job market, and his mental health spiraled down, and we were on benefits for many, many years. And I know firsthand from this experience what it means, though I must add that we did have some privileges, that even though my father had mental health problems, he was kind of sort of higher educated, so he spent much time appealing the decisions of the tax system and writing letters and so on. And he had that capacity, kind of. And also, we had some kind of safety net of some family that could come to aid when there was a real emergency. So our situation was in many respects still one of certain privileges, but you can imagine that this experience prompted much interest for me in, you know, how this whole benefit system works. It also made me, I think, a way more sensitive for what it feels like to be on benefits, what the impact is beyond the material impact, the psychological impact, etc. So I closely followed the scandal, and for me, what I actually like to stress today is that the way I've read it and analyzed it and followed it is actually the minor role of technology in this case. And this is where I think there's a difference between maybe me and how Amnesty sees it. I mean, I definitely agree it was framed as an administrative issue and not a human rights issue. And I would add that it should not only be framed much more as a human rights issue, but as a social justice issue. And I'm going to try to explain as quick as I can what that means for me. Like reading the careful investigative research that was done by many journalists, looking at the internal documents that were released as part of the big FOIA request, that like tech was one of the least of the issues here, unlike some other scandal like Robodebt in Australia or some of the great examples that are given in the book Automating Inequality. And what is striking when looking into this, not surprising, and I will get back to why it was not surprising in the least, but it was striking at the level of like the complete obsession with potential fraud and the stubborn persistence to hunt down people for fraud, ignoring all the evidence the beneficiaries brought to the fore, which proved there was no fraud. The department that was tasked with fraud detection was choosing to follow the horrendous policy in its most strict sense. They were choosing to follow the policies furthermore in a horrendous, very human-driven insistence on the most denigrating, humiliating racist stereotypes. If you read their emails, it's very sickening. The way they insisted to search their kind of shadow database for nationality or ethnicity was not just something automated or something that an algorithm kind of prompted. It was very human driven. And the complete disregard and I would say sociopathic lack of empathy was also very human driven. And that's another thing that I found lacking in this debate, is that this is, of course, nothing new. There's a long historical lineage from the poor houses and the poor colonies in the Netherlands, for example, Veenhuizen, and the poor colonies that were invited, mind you, by a certain gentleman who also served the Dutch overseas colonies, where he repressed the local population there. There's a direct link. And if one wants to understand how this could have happened, it's this fundamental hunting down and disciplining of the poor since centuries, the malicious distinction made between the undeserving and the poor. Now, all of this is not to say that technology has always been instrumental in these repressive efforts. One can see that also in history, and we can talk about that more if it interests you, and that there's this kind of specific role of technology that makes it a very powerful weapon. It's not only that technology is instrumental for power in its efficiency, which the promise does not always fulfill, but it's functioning as this rationalizing, normalizing, and neutralizing shield for what's obviously not a technocratic matter of catching corrupt behavior, but a form of class war, I would say. And Ruha Benjamin also describes this magic power of technology to make it something neutral, something outside politics. And what I'm struggling with is that as soon as we localize the problem within the technology somehow, as soon as we point to the algorithm and declare how racist it indeed is and connect that to how it should be more ethical or objective, how privacy should be built in, human rights standards should be built in some way, though this work is important, but we have to be wary that there's a danger of disconnecting the technology, as the politicians do, from the power structures, from ideology, as if there can be something as fair tech in an unfair world, as if there can be something like a fair welfare fraud detection algorithm, right? Now, because what you get is some kind of mirror image of tech solutionism, as this old discourse of tech solutionism, where tech would save us because it solves the flawed human that is the problem, and then the neutral technology is the solution. Now it becomes the technology, the calculating computers, the called algorithms that we point to as the cause of evil. As if what and how they calculate is not completely human designed, as if not all tech is human. And what I hear a lot in the Toeslag affair, and this is why I kind of extensively make that point, around me, I hear a lot of people say, they're like, oh, it's such a scandal, and these algorithms, the computers, the humanity of those automated systems. And there's this like common consensus that what is called in Dutch, the menselijke maat was lost, which means like the human measure or scale, the human in the loop. But it was full of humans in the loop. And it makes me shiver as I think of all the humans making the policies and the plans, the humans assessing the cases, the humans of the control teams, and racist slurs, their house visits. And I think of the very humans on our doorsteps in my youth, their tone of voice, the contempt born from the way the poor are seen as suspect and criminal. There's a whole range of papers and research on the repressive welfare state for people to dig in. But I want to, I also want to propose kind of an alternative move, first of all, this debate from the expert-driven spaces that tend to come with maybe including me here, right? The debate is often happening in expert spaces as this, like technology, legal spaces. And we did, with the Table of Justice, Equity and Technology, we did a session with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. And they kind of emphasized that their work really looks to kind of go further because they feel that these expert conversations kind of narrowly define how the harms of these systems are to be understood. And it creates an emphasis on issues of bias and transparency or debates around constitutional violations. And these kind of priorities and politics are not necessarily relevant for people experience the harm most directly. For them, it doesn't really matter if they're surveyed legally or illegally. Like the consequence is still there. So they really say we've had enough. And I see that I'm a bit over time, so I'm going to round up here. And they propose a different model, which is here, which is looking at these systems with the system. Because they said, you need to look beyond the programs to the broader inputs and ecosystems surrounding them. If you're fighting against a particular program or system or algorithm, the response will be, you're right, that's bad. Let's take a new thing, which is in fact designed to be more durable and can outmaneuver the criticism that the community was making. So to really address the root causes, the way poverty is seen, the kind of ideology behind this hunt on these parents and dismantle the system, you cannot just be organizing against one example. You need to target not only the particular program, but the entire ecosystem that surrounds this. And the question of how to do that, we can discuss later.
Thank you so much, Sanne, for this very powerful and also inspiring presentation. Then last but certainly not least, on to Nadia, who will take the first steps into drawing the discussion a bit broader. And the guiding question that we discussed is, how does this relate to broader issues on the use of technology in government and its related agencies? Nadia?
Yeah, thank you, Mira and Sanne, for sharing your thoughts. I agree with a lot that has been said, so I'm sure there will be some overlap in my thoughts that I'm about to share, but I would still like to stress out two issues that the child benefit scandal illustrates really well, which is discrimination, firstly, and the second one is lack of transparency, accountability, and effective redress. So like Merel has mentioned before, while hunting on fraud cases in which parents might have received unlawful child benefit allowance, the tax authority thought that people with a second nationality, meaning ethnic minorities, and people with a lower income, meaning people who need the benefits most, might have a higher risk of committing fraud. So many were categorized as fraudsters, and the allowances, in many cases, thousands of euros were recovered. And people lost their jobs because they couldn't afford daycare anymore. People lost their houses because the debts were unpayable. And this has led to broken homes in which children were growing up in poverty. And some were even removed from their parents. So this was a result of racism and social economic discrimination. Some blamed this on a broken system. We disagree. The system isn't broken. The system and its algorithms are doing exactly what they're told by people. We need to face that we as a people face serious problems in our societies that need to be addressed. We face discrimination, we face lack of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, violations to the right of privacy, and so on and so forth. So the standards that many countries have agreed upon years ago when it comes to fundamental rights are still not effective in reality. Therefore, it isn't strange that the data that comes out from our society are a reflection of the problems that we're facing. This data isn't neutral or objective because society isn't, and neither is government policy. We've already seen too many cases in which our government has willingly profiled on ethnic minorities and people with a low income, not accidentally, not because of a broken system, but willingly because some governments and policymakers think it's a good idea to make discriminating policy. We often speak of algorithmic biases, and we should, but let's also not forget that these biases are mirroring our societies. And therefore, we need to make sure that AI legislation protects fundamental rights, which brings me to my second issue, lack of transparency, accountability, and effective redress. So many people who were affected by the tax authority were people of color, and many had a feeling they were ethnically profiled, but they were unable to prove it. And at some point, a group of people used their right of access to find out what has led to decision-making in their dossier. And in response to that, the tax authority sent them large directories that were almost completely blackened and therefore unable to read. And even though this part wasn't even about algorithms, this illustrates perfectly how important transparency in decision-making really is. So in Dutch administrative law, government bodies are obliged to motivate their decisions in an understandable way, and decisions should be free from discrimination and arbitrariness. And people need to be able to object to a decision and have access to a judge to fight a decision. So these are basic rights that should be normal in a democratic society. However, the current law proposal, the Artificial Intelligence Act, does not provide this level of legal protection yet. People have hardly any rights to enforce transparency, much less accountability. And for some reason, we're setting the bar really low when it comes to legal protection against AI. And of course, we know that transparency and accountability are words that are easier said than done, as technology doesn't seem to be ready to make decisions that are understandable for humans. However, by setting the bar this low, no developer will be challenged to improve that. So to sum up, the EU seems to be in a race trying to compete with major powers that are running ahead in AI development, which is really a stupid thing to do. The EU should be setting an example on how to innovate while protecting human rights. We think that's the only way that is future-proof.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for also connecting this discussion to the EU regulatory debate and what's going on there. I think it's also a very productive perspective. Now, before we move on to the broader discussion and Jill's questions, I do want to give you three the opportunity to respond to each other if there are already concrete things you want to say or ask. And if not, we can move on to the questions and keep the different discussion for the Q&A. But please grab the floor if there are any reactions. If not, then I am very good.
Maybe just to stress that the root causes that were outlined by Sonne, this is absolutely something that is seen by a human rights organization such as Amnesty International. Looking at the childcare benefits scandal on the tech side, for us is a way to have an example and show how these systemic injustices translate to once they are being automated. So I do feel that maybe we're not that far apart in seeing the issue, absolutely in how we then address it as Amnesty works with international human rights standards is very differently. And I see amazing opportunities to merge these two, and also the work of Jet. So I have a question, actually. Can I pose a question to a different panel member? Yeah. Because I am very curious what type of solutions or what type of processes or work you are doing. And also, you mentioned bias, transparency. These are very expert solutions that do not directly address the situation or the problems that affected communities feel or that they feel that should be dealt with. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? Because I think that would be really valuable for a digital rights crowd, such as we have here at Privacy Camp.
Thank you, Merel. And of course, I agree that we have similar, I think we are allies in this fight, right? So what do we do to address these issues? I think our focus as a table is much more to look at like how can you strengthen the communities to kind of to contend with the systems, like build grassroots power, organizing, do their own community-driven research, choose their own priorities and what they want to campaign about, etc. And also support each other, learn from each other in these fights. So that's the work the network is trying to do. And we're also trying to find points of interventions at different levels. So, like, for example, I think this community grassroots-driven work is something that a lot of people saying, like, that's a good idea, we should do more of that. Sadly, there's hardly any funding for it. I must say that capacity mostly goes to these expert places of, like, legal contestation or technology design, etc. So there's an issue there. But this grassroots organizing, I think, how do you do that without, I think, kind of exploiting these communities again, you know, or being fetishizing community activism? I think that's a very interesting question. And there I would like to pose or to propose that we, as experts in a certain, I don't know if I want to call myself expert, but here I am, right? That we in our, all address this issue also in our environment. So for example, I want to give this example for this crowd specifically. One of our members, No Tech for Tyrants, addresses the role of academia in designing kind of harmful technologies, addresses the funding from like Deloitte, from all these like welfare frauds detection algorithm designers, address kind of these programs that, for example, EU funded in the AI arms race, promise all these solutions of AI to solve our discrimination, to solve our biases, etc. But of course, don't deliver that in a very unjust system, as Nadia already spoke out. And this, I think what hearing from people and also from my experience, I think what is super important, what is a super important distinction to make is this focus on universal human rights standards versus a community that's criminalized and for whom these so-called universal human rights standards often do not apply because by governments, they're pushed into anti-terrorism like programs, into fraudsters, into etc. So of course, like the fight for the actual implementation of human rights. I mean, if we could already do that, it's amazing, and I support all the court cases that are being fought there, etc., etc. But there's a big part that even if you say like we're against, like we want to make sure that there's a better legal framework, that you will see that these communities are criminalized, and therefore the protection that offers to many of us won't offer them protection. And this is also my experience in my personal life. And this is also why I'm a very cynical person about like legal kind of pathways. So I apologize for that, because I do see that it's one of the parts of the struggle that it's important, just as the grassroots activism is. And just as like, let's just be honest, the material supports, like working for that, for people, you know, supporting them, helping people to fill out their documents or forms, for example. That's also really important part of the struggle of the grassroots groups that we're working with. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Silne. Perfect. I think it's such an important point also to emphasize the limitations of these human rights standards in this regard, and the exceptions and the suspension of normal protection if you talk about these type of cases. If there are no other specific interventions and points more focused on the child benefit scandal, I would like to give the floor to Jill.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Naomi, also for your wonderfully composed and calm moderating skills, and also for the speakers for sharing their perspective. I think I also want to pick up, I mean, we've already kind of gone into a little bit like reflecting on the broader kind of discussions beyond the Dutch childcare benefit scandal. But then I think bringing back to Sanne's last point, and also Nadia's previous presentation, in the sense of, Nadia, how do you kind of see, or how would you react, I think, to some of the issues that Sanne has raised, right? Like this kind of, not tension, but kind of how there's a lot of energy being put into reacting or contributing to some of the legal frameworks that are ongoing at the EU level, and increasingly so because there are even more proposals, which also requires the effort of civil society and NGOs reacting to those. But then also, where does that leave the resources that are needed, or organizations and expertise that are needed for these kind of communities? How do you see, I would say, not reconciling, but how do we move forward in terms of the idea that, well, there are just a lack of resources in so many areas? Could you respond a little bit to that?
Of course, and yeah, I can definitely understand where Sanne is coming from with, as she says, a cynical view on law. I, as a lawyer, was obviously triggered by that as I became a lawyer to fight this social injustice. I really view the law as a tool to challenge these injustices. But I definitely agree that our human rights framework is great in theory, but is not effective yet in many countries that have agreed upon this framework. So there is a lot of work that still needs to be done in that way. And I think digital rights organizations, but also anti-racism organizations and other organizations that are trying to improve the protection of human rights can contribute to that. But we're facing a situation in which governments, especially in Europe and the US, are very racist and are willingly making policies that are racist. So there is a huge gap between rights that need to protect minorities and affected groups on one side, and what these governments are doing on the other side.
Yeah, thank you, Nadia. Sorry, there's a question from Claire that I think I will pick up before I have a lot of questions actually, but I'm going to prioritize the Q&A. So Claire is asking whether anyone from the panel can tell us more about the legislative developments in the Netherlands, as the scandal didn't affect the election results at all, and the government is still planning to continue with the fraud detection system, right?
Yeah. So far what we have seen and what I've heard from the Secretary of State and the Minister, that more than 320 initiatives have been started to fix the damage from the childcare benefit scandal, but there's no comprehensive list on what these initiatives are, so or specific criteria. So this is very worrisome, because the same group of government workers that continued and built this place of inequality in their systems now are internally fixing this, of course with the help from outsiders. But if you had an anti-discrimination course for maybe 3 afternoons, that is not enough to fix these inequalities. Like, that is absolutely not enough. So this is highly problematic. Also, what we see because there's now finally a new government. The government fell over the childcare benefit scandal in the beginning of 2021. Now, the end of 2022, there was finally a new government formed, and there's now a government, how do you say that? Statement, like a plan for the next years. And the human rights protection, in order to one, address systemic racism, and two, also address the technology side of this of the inequality that we saw with the childcare benefit scandal. It is not enough. It looks great if you look at the government statement that there will be an AI supervisor, but guess what? That comes from EU regulation, the AI Act. So it's really like presenting it as a step forward, whereas that is the absolute minimum that you could copy and put in your plans, just what is happening in the EU